The dog wouldn't let anyone near an abandoned car. When the police arrived, they couldn't believe what they saw. The dog's courageous and tearful journey began. The rain came down in relentless torrents, splashing against windows, thundering on rooftops, and filling the street until it looked more like a fast-moving river than a quiet neighborhood road. Distant thunder rolled through the sky, each rumble followed by sharp bursts of lightning that lit up the darkened suburb where Mick's barking echoed like a siren cutting through the storm. But this wasn't an ordinary bark. Mick's voice held an urgency, a deep, steady rhythm that pierced the night, rising above the rain and thunder with an edge of desperation. Soaked to the bone, the large, dark-furred dog circled a battered sedan abandoned on the edge of the neighborhood. His bark, a deep, steady roar, bounced off the wet pavement, each sound carrying a message that was impossible to ignore. Soon enough, a few neighbors braved the rain, peering from behind their doors and windows, scanning the street where Mick stood his ground. Jacobs, lean and wiry, with the guarded posture of someone used to sizing up danger, stepped outside. Dressed in a worn military jacket, flashlight in hand, he squinted through the rain, taking in the scene, a drenched Mick, eyes wild, darting between the car and the people who dared come near. "What's that mutt got to bark about?" someone murmured from their porch. Jacobs shook his head, mostly to himself. "Nothing good," he muttered. He knew the sedan. It had been parked there for weeks, rusting under the indifferent sky. But tonight, something felt different. An odd, almost threatening air hung over the scene. And Mick? Mick was standing firm, his bark climbing in intensity with every step someone took toward the car. One by one, others gathered, some with umbrellas, others just holding their coats tight against the rain. They huddled together, whispers and nervous glances passing between them. The smell of wet pavement mixed with something metallic, a faint, almost bitter scent that seemed to cling to the air. "Hey, back off!" Jacobs shouted as a younger man raised a stick in Mick's direction, his grip tight, shoulders squared with resolve. Mick didn't budge. His growl turned lower, his soaked fur clinging tightly to his lean frame as he stood like a stone wall, challenging anyone to come closer. His muscles coiled, ears sharply angled forward, ready to spring if it came to that. "What's with him?" someone finally asked, the question falling into the thick tension that filled the air. But nobody had an answer. Seeing Mick hold his ground as they advanced only made the crowd more uneasy. Some whispered about calling animal control. Others urged the young man with the stick to go ahead. But Mick's eyes held them fast, intense, unwavering, with a strange fire that none of them could quite explain, but somehow understood enough not to challenge. Then a voice broke through the crowd, calm yet firm. "This dog's not here to harm anyone," called Mrs. Marta, an elderly widow who'd lived on the street longer than most. Wrapped in an old raincoat, her shoulders draped in a shawl, she watched Mick with a knowing, almost tender look. Her gaze lingered on the blood-matting Mick's head, on his soaked, trembling body. "He's protecting something," she went on, raising a hand as if to calm the restless crowd. "Whatever's got him upset, it's not us." A hush settled over the group, broken only by Mick's labored breathing and the unrelenting beat of the rain. Mrs. Marta held her ground, her face set in quiet resolve as she reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her phone. "I think it's time we call Clark. He is the police. He knows what we have to do," she murmured, dialing with a steady hand, her voice calm but certain. As she waited for the call to connect, her eyes stayed fixed on Mick. It was as if she could see what no one else could. Mick's bark softened slightly, his gaze flicking to her as though he recognized her trust, even in the middle of the chaos. His trembling, blood-speckled stance, wet from the relentless rain, took on a weight that no one else could ignore. Before long, the street was awash in red and blue, police lights cutting through the rain, casting a harsh glow over the crowd. Mick didn't flinch, staying perfectly still as two officers stepped out of their car, their eyes moving from the silent crowd to the dog and finally to Mrs. Marta. She raised her hand in greeting, her face a mixture of relief and urgency. Mick, steady as stone, stayed rooted in place, his breathing deep but steady, his gaze locked on the officers as if carrying a message only he could understand. And as they approached, a strange, quiet tension settled over the street. All murmurs and whispers faded as everyone waited, held by the eerie calm that had replaced Mick's barking. It was clear that whatever lay inside that car was about to reveal a secret none of them were prepared to face. One of them, Clark Harris, a tall man with years of handling animals in the force, took a moment to size up the situation. Clark observed Mick's ragged breathing and matted fur, his own gaze steady but cautious. He'd dealt with dogs guarding houses, dogs defending people. But something about Mick's presence here struck him differently. Clark raised his hand to signal the other officer to hang back, then took a slow step forward, arms relaxed and open, speaking softly. "Easy, buddy. No one's here to hurt you or anyone else," he murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. He took another step closer, holding Mick's gaze. "We're just here to help, okay?" The rain pelted down harder, as if urging them to hurry. Mick's eyes darted from Clark to the car door, then back to Clark. A low growl escaped his throat, but he held his ground, his body language tense, protective, every fiber of him clearly saying, "No one's coming near this car on my watch." The dog's nostrils flared, and he eyed Clark, sizing up the gesture before slowly lowering his head and inching forward, cautiously sniffing at the offering. For a moment, he tore his gaze from Clark and shifted back to the car. With every inch that Mick backed up, Clark moved forward, slowly reaching for the car door, watching Mick as much as he watched the lock. It was almost as if Mick was giving Clark permission, the dog's breath coming in short, desperate pants. Clark felt the faintest sense of gratitude in the air, and that, more than anything, made his heart tighten. Finally, Clark popped the door open, and his heart sank at the sight inside. In the back seat, wrapped in a ragged old blanket, lay a baby, tiny, unmoving, and as pale as the fabric that swaddled it. The child looked fragile beyond words. Clark's training kicked in. He reached in carefully, pulling the baby out, holding its limp form against his chest. The other officer quickly radioed for an ambulance, urgency lacing his every word. But Clark's attention stayed fixed on the small, weightless bundle he held, feeling a desperation rise in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Mick let out a soft, almost pitiful whine, stepping forward, his eyes glued to the baby as Clark carried it toward the patrol car. The dog limped after him, weakened but resolute, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. The officers helped Mick into the car, wet and weary as he was, letting him settle in the back with a tired but determined look in his eyes. Every time Clark's gaze drifted back to the rearview mirror, there was Mick, staring unwaveringly at the baby in Clark's arms. At the hospital, nurses and doctors rushed forward to take the child, working swiftly to check vital signs and stabilize the frail little body. Mick stayed close by, refusing to be separated, pacing outside the room until Clark intervened, allowing the dog to sit beside the bed where the child lay. Mick curled up beside the baby, lowering his head with a quiet whimper, his eyes drooping as exhaustion claimed him. The sight touched everyone who passed by. Nurses whispered to one another, stealing glances through the small observation window, marveling at the unlikely pair. A dog so fiercely devoted, guarding the baby even now, as if his life's purpose had been to protect this fragile soul all along. One nurse knelt beside Mick, reaching out to gently stroke his battered fur. The dog barely moved, his breaths slow and deep as he finally allowed himself to rest. Clark stayed nearby, watching, feeling a knot of unexpected emotion rise in his throat. He'd seen loyalty in dogs before, but this was something different, something almost sacred. "You've done enough," he murmured to Mick, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll take it from here." But Mick stayed close, even in his sleep, his head resting on the child's tiny blanket, his loyalty unwavering. And as the rain continued to beat down outside, as the baby's heartbeat steadied, and as Clark looked on with a mix of awe and sorrow, it became clear to everyone there. Mick was no ordinary dog. By dawn, the quiet of the hospital halls was broken by a deep, insistent bark. Mick's throaty growls filled the corridors, echoing sharply, drawing startled looks from the medical staff. Most patients and doctors gave the dog a wide berth, uncertain of what to make of this anxious, disheveled animal pacing in front of room 207. It was only when Clark approached that Mick finally calmed, his paws steady as he waited, panting with watchful eyes fixed on Clark. Clark crouched beside the dog, eyes narrowing as he looked at the bruised fur and the hastily bandaged wound on Mick's head. "All right, boy, what's got you riled up here?" Clark asked, his voice low and calm, though his mind was already puzzling over the significance of Mick's unusual loyalty. Without hesitation, Mick nudged his head toward the door, his whole body vibrating with anticipation. Clark gave the dog a careful look, a mixture of curiosity and respect. He wasn't just any dog. There was a resolve in Mick's posture, something that told Clark this wasn't some random pet acting out. It was as if Mick had a purpose, one he wasn't going to leave unfulfilled. Pushing the door open, Clark stepped into the room, Mick following at his heel. Inside, a young woman lay motionless on the bed, her face pallid against the white pillow, her breathing shallow and labored. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, tracking every faltering heartbeat, every breath. Mick, with surprising gentleness for a creature his size, padded over to the bed, his movements slow and tender as he nudged his nose against her hand, licking her fingers softly. The dog's tail thumped the floor once, a silent plea, as his gaze remained locked on the young woman. Clark felt a strange pang watching the scene. This dog clearly knew her, and if Mick's behavior was any indication, they shared something deeper than just a passing familiarity. Moving closer, Clark scanned the woman's face, taking in her gaunt features, the faint lines of strain around her eyes, the bruised shade beneath them. Her medical file lay on a side table, half hidden beneath a stack of charts. Linda Moreno, Clark read quietly, flipping through the pages. He was no doctor, but he'd seen enough in his line of work to read between the lines. Terminal breast cancer, late stage. Her condition was deteriorating, quickly. She was only 20 years old, and according to the chart, had recently given birth. A 3-month-old infant. His mind flickered back to the events of the previous night, the baby left in the car, the dog standing guard, the frantic barks. It clicked into place with chilling clarity. Clark glanced at Mick, who was now resting his head against Linda's hand, his eyes shut as if hoping, perhaps even praying, that she might awaken. The dog let out a soft whimper, a sound filled with longing and worry, his loyalty as tangible as the sterile hospital walls surrounding them. Then, to Clark's surprise, Linda stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Mick's head shot up, his tail now wagging gently as he pressed himself even closer to her side. Linda's eyes opened slowly, taking in the room before finally resting on Mick. Her expression softened instantly, a weary but grateful smile forming as she whispered, "Mick, you're here." It was only then that she seemed to realize someone else was in the room. Clark introduced himself, his voice quiet but steady. "Linda, there was a baby last night, found in a car outside. Do you?" "My son," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. Panic flitted across her features. Is he okay?" Her gaze darted between Clark and Mick, her eyes wide with concern. "He's safe," Clark assured her, taking note of her relief. "We found him just in time, thanks to Mick here." He watched as she closed her eyes momentarily, taking in the words with a soft sigh. Linda let her fingers brush Mick's fur, the gesture filled with an exhausted kind of gratitude. "He saved him. Saved both of us," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "We've been through so much together." The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady hum of machines and the faint beeping of the monitor beside Linda's bed. Clark sat beside her, his expression softening as Linda gathered herself, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with a resolve forged by hardship. "Funny how life works," Linda began, her eyes drifting toward the window as if seeking answers in the grey sky beyond. "One day, you're just living. You've got plans, dreams. Everything feels like it's falling into place. Then it's all taken from you." She paused, taking a slow, deep breath. "It was like that for me." Clark listened, his gaze steady, absorbing every word, the subtle hints of her pain evident in the tremor of her voice. She reached out to stroke Mick's head, the loyal dog that had stood by her side, now curled up on the floor by her bed, watching her with quiet vigilance. "We got him, Mick. I mean, back when everything was fine." She smiled faintly, though it barely reached her eyes. "He was just a pup then, clumsy and full of energy. My boyfriend at the time, Darren, thought Mick would be good company. I did too." Her words lingered, each carrying a weight of memories she seemed reluctant to touch. But people change. Or maybe it's just that we start to see them for who they really are when things get hard. Clark nodded, his silence a gentle nudge for her to continue. He could see the tension in her face, how each word cost her. "Darren wasn't interested in sticking around once he found out about the baby," she said, her tone bitter but controlled. "He made that clear enough. Told me he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. And when I refused to—" She hesitated, her jaw tightening. "Do what he wanted. He threw me out." Linda swallowed, a hand drifting instinctively to her stomach as if to recall the memory of carrying her son close. "I didn't know what to do, where to go. I had no family to turn to, no friends left who could help. All I had was Mick." She looked down at the dog, whose eyes were still fixed on her, calm and constant, and a small, sad smile appeared on her face. "When I left, he followed me. Wouldn't let me go alone." She looked away, the memory of those early days stark against the sterile backdrop of the hospital. "We were on the streets for weeks. I was terrified, exhausted. But Mick, he was everything I didn't know I needed." She exhaled, her voice breaking slightly, but she kept on. "He'd stand watch all night while I tried to sleep, his ears perked for every sound, every shadow that crossed our path. He protected us, protected me, and my son." Clark's heart tightened at her words. He had seen courage in people before, but this was different. It was resilience mixed with sacrifice, a fight born out of love rather than duty. Then the rain came, she continued softly, her voice carrying a weight Clark hadn't heard before. We were caught in a downpour 2 nights ago. I'd found this old car parked on the street, no one around. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Her fingers clenched tightly, her gaze distant. I had to leave him, my boy, in that car, just for a little while. I told Mick to stay with him. I thought I'd be back before he'd even know I was gone. Her voice broke, and for a moment, Clark thought she wouldn't continue. But she took a steadying breath, pushing forward, clutching the thin hospital blanket with trembling hands. I'd walked blocks, soaking wet, trying to find someone, anyone who might help, but my body, it finally gave out. She looked up at Clark, her eyes brimming with a sadness he could feel. I didn't make it back. Instead, I woke up here. Clark's hand tightened on the chair, fighting the urge to reach out, to offer a comfort he knew words couldn't give. You did everything you could, he said gently. You've survived more than most people can even imagine. But Linda shook her head, her gaze drifting back to Mick, who looked up at her, eyes filled with a silent, unwavering loyalty. It wasn't just me. Mick, he's been there every step of the way. Even when I couldn't do more, he was there for us both. She brushed her fingers against Mick's fur, her voice now barely a whisper. I don't know how he understood, but he did. He knew that my son was all I had left, and he protected him, just like he protected me. For a long moment, the two sat in silence, the weight of her words settling between them. Clark saw something more than just survival in her story. He saw the quiet bravery of a mother, the fierce loyalty of a dog who'd refused to abandon her. And in Mick's watchful eyes, he saw a devotion as profound as any he'd ever known. Finally, Clark leaned forward, his voice steady and certain. Whatever happens, Linda, Mick, your boy, they're safe now, and I promise you, he added softly, they'll stay that way. The sterile hospital air hung thick around Linda's room, mingling with the faint scent of antiseptic and sterile linens. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow through the blinds that painted quiet patterns across the bedsheets. Linda lay there, her frame frail and wasted, her skin pallid under the dim lights. Every breath came with effort, shallow and rattling, each exhale a reminder of the struggle her body was losing. The cancer had ravaged her insides, twisting and tearing until there was hardly anything left to fight back with. Mick, she whispered one evening, her voice barely audible. It took all her strength just to reach her hand over the edge of the bed, where Mick lifted his head and nuzzled his nose against her fingers. She felt the warmth of him, a contrast to the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She managed a thin smile. You're still here, huh? His tail thumped softly against the floor, a small, steady reassurance. Clark, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, looked up, observing the exchange. His face was unreadable, but there was a sadness in his eyes that matched Mick's. Linda knew she had little time left, that each day was a gift she couldn't afford to take for granted. She could feel it, her strength waning, slipping through her fingers. And yet, every day she clung to her reason for waking up. Her son, her little boy who was somewhere just down the hall in the nursery. When they brought him in each morning, she'd cradle him to her chest, breathing in the soft, sweet scent of his hair, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. And she would look at Clark, standing just behind them, his face full of that same silent compassion. One evening, as the shadows grew longer and Linda could barely keep her eyes open, she beckoned Clark over. He hesitated, His brows knitted, but moved closer to her side. She took his hand in hers, and for a moment she just held it, drawing comfort from the simple, quiet strength of his presence. "Clark," she said, her voice little more than a whisper, "when I'm gone, will you look after him? And Mick, too." She squeezed his hand, her grip weak but determined. "Promise me they'll be safe, that he'll have a home." Clark nodded, a single firm dip of his head. His eyes held hers, and she could see the solemnity there, the weight of his unspoken vow. "I promise, Linda. I'll make sure he's taken care of. And Mick, too?" He swallowed hard, looking down at the dog, who met his gaze with that same unbreakable loyalty. "They'll have a family." Relief washed over Linda, softening her drawn face, and she let out a shuddering breath. It was enough. She knew Clark would keep his word. She had nothing left to give but her trust, and it was a gift she could part with easily, knowing it would be in safe hands. The days that followed were hazy, filled with brief moments of lucidity, broken by long stretches of sleep. Mick rarely left her side, his head resting against the bed, his eyes closing only when she slept. Nurses and doctors moved in and out, tending to her as she drifted further away. Clark came every day, and Linda could sense his presence, even if she couldn't always see him. His voice was a steady hum, his touch a reminder of the promise he'd made. In her final moments, as her breath grew shallow and her grip slackened, Linda opened her eyes one last time. Clark was there, standing beside her, his hand wrapped around hers, steady and sure. Mick pressed his warm body against her side, his muzzle tucked close to her heart. She could feel his fur, soft and comforting, grounding her in these last fragile seconds. A faint smile crossed her lips as she exhaled, her spirit slipping free, leaving behind the ache, the weight, and the struggle. Clark held her hand a moment longer, eyes wet and gaze unwavering. And in that stillness, he felt the enormity of the promise he'd made. It had been nearly a month since Linda passed away. Clark and his wife have completed the adoption process for the boy and Mick. The air in the house had softened, its old corners touched by the sounds of quiet footsteps and the muffled barks of Mick, a solemn yet resilient presence that had now become part of Clark and his wife's lives. They moved with care around the small child. They named him Tommy, their new family member, who lay napping in a cradle near the front window, where light sifted through the lace curtains in soft, dappled patches. There was a depth in those eyes, a certain understanding that only the old and the loyal held, as if Mick alone carried the memory of what Linda had sacrificed to give her son a chance at life. Clark could feel it too. Every time he looked at the boy, a pang of something fierce and tender stirred within him. Clark, his wife Hannah, whispered one evening after they'd put the baby to bed and Mick had settled beside the cradle. "Do you ever think about how much he's already been through?" He nodded slowly, looking down at the scuffed wooden floor. "Every day," he replied, his voice a murmur. "And I think Mick does too. That dog. He knows something, Hannah. He acts like he was meant to be here, guarding this boy." Hannah smiled gently, watching Mick, whose eyes never left the child even as they spoke. "Well, he's not alone. Neither of them are." Over time, the boy grew accustomed to their warmth and routine. He'd stir and babble, reaching up toward Clark with tiny fingers that wrapped firmly around his thumb, and Clark felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper with each passing day. Mick, too, found his way into the rhythm of the household. In the evenings, as the last rays of light dimmed, Clark would see Mick trot from the kitchen to the nursery, check on the child, and then return to lie by the crib, his form a gentle shadow of protection. The neighborhood, once filled with whispers and lingering stares, had softened its gaze. Folks who had once gathered with suspicion and a bit of fear on that stormy night now stopped by the house with gifts of food or small blankets, offering nods of quiet support for the little family that had grown under unusual circumstances. One evening, old Mrs. Taylor from down the street, with her cane and heavy coat, shuffled up their walk. She had a patchwork quilt in her hands, stitched together with faded scraps that had seen better days. But her smile was kind and warm. "For the boy," she said simply, nodding toward the house. "I've had it around for years, but it's time it went somewhere it's needed." Clark thanked her, a lump rising in his throat as he took the quilt, knowing this was more than just a piece of fabric. It was the neighborhood's blessing, its acceptance of his family, of Mick, and of Linda's legacy. They weren't just onlookers anymore, they were participants, part of a shared story that had begun on that stormy night. As the boy grew, Clark found himself recounting bits of Linda's story, weaving them into quiet bedtime tales. He'd speak of her kindness, her strength, and the love she bore for her son. He would wait until the boy was old enough to understand fully, but for now, Clark let the tales linger in his son's dreams, planting seeds of memory that would one day grow. "Your mother was brave, and she loved you more than anything," Clark would say, his voice barely a whisper, as the boy's eyes grew heavy with sleep. Mick would lay close by, his ears twitching at the familiar words, his loyalty undiminished, his presence as steady as the ticking clock in the hall. It was in moments like these that Clark felt the weight of Linda's trust in him, the silent charge she'd left, knowing that her son would need someone to hold her story and share it with him, so he'd never forget where he'd come from. In the quiet house, with Mick's gentle breathing and the soft snores of the boy filling the space, Clark felt the house transforming. It was no longer just his home. It had become a place of legacy and love, woven together by loss and resilience. As the months passed, the small family found a kind of peace, a peace anchored by loyalty, love, and the quiet guardianship of a dog who understood, better than anyone, the story they were living. And so the days stretched on, each one grounding them deeper into the life they had built together, bound by a promise, one that had been Linda's last and was now their first, unbreakable as the threads that bound them. Family, now and forever. The house was quiet as Clark looked around the cozy living room, noticing how the soft lamplight gave everything a warm glow. Tommy, their little boy, was playing on the carpet, building towers out of blocks with an intensity only kids seemed to know. Mick, their loyal dog, lay sprawled out beside him, watchful as ever, his dark eyes following each move of the boy's small hands. Hannah, Clark's wife, sat beside him on the couch, her gaze moving fondly between Tommy and Mick, a gentle smile lingering on her lips. "Tommy's growing up so fast," Hannah said, her voice soft. "Feels like just yesterday we brought him home. Now look at him, building castles and forts like he owns the place." Clark nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he watched the scene before him. "Yeah, I know. Every day he looks a little more like he's finding his place here." He paused, watching Mick as he nuzzled closer to Tommy's hand, ever the loyal protector. And Mick can't believe how patient he is with Tommy, almost like he knows he's got a job to do. "He does, Clark," Hannah replied, her gaze warm as it settled on Mick. "That dog's been through so much already. He knows more about loyalty than most people ever will. It's like he's made it his life's work to look after Tommy, to make sure he's safe." As if hearing his name, Mick lifted his head, his dark eyes flicking from Tommy to Clark, a quiet intelligence in his gaze. Clark felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something he couldn't quite put into words. This wasn't just a dog. Mick was family, the silent, steady heart of their home. For Clark, that loyalty had changed everything, binding them together in ways he couldn't have imagined before Tommy and Hannah had come into his life. "Hey, Tommy!" Hannah called, her voice gentle as she watched her son stack another block, a tiny grin on his face. "Did you know Mick was there when we found you? He made sure you stayed safe until Daddy came." Tommy looked up, his wide, curious eyes moving between his parents and Mick. He didn't fully understand, not yet, but the look of awe was there. "Mick kept me safe?" he asked, his small voice filled with wonder. Clark nodded, leaning forward. "That's right, kiddo. Mick's your best friend. He's been looking out for you from the very start, just like your mum did." Hannah put a hand on Clark's arm, squeezing gently. They had shared the story with Tommy as he'd grown, bit by bit, not overwhelming him, but giving him enough to know that his life was full of people, and one loyal dog who loved him deeply. She hoped that, as he grew older, Tommy would understand the gift of that love, the strength it took for someone to look out for you no matter what. As the evening went on, Tommy eventually fell asleep, his head resting on Mick's warm fur. Clark gently scooped him up, carrying him to his room, while Mick followed close, settling by the doorway once Clark tucked Tommy in. Back in the living room, Hannah sat beside him, both of them sitting in silence for a moment, feeling the quiet peace that settled over the house like a warm blanket. "You know," Clark said softly, "sometimes I think Mick's taught me more about love than anything or anyone else. That kind of loyalty, it's rare." Hannah nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Love isn't always in big gestures or big words. Sometimes it's just showing up, staying, being there for each other, day in and day out." She paused, glancing back toward Tommy's room where Mick now lay, curled up as if he were standing guard over the boy. "I hope Tommy grows up to understand that, to be grateful for it." Clark wrapped an arm around her, nodding. "He will, Hannah. With you as his mum, and with Mick by his side, he'll grow up knowing the kind of love that matters." In the quiet that followed, Clark felt an unshakable peace, a sense of completeness that had once seemed impossible. Tommy, safe in his room, Mick, their steadfast companion, and Hannah, the warmth that filled every corner of their lives. Together, they were more than family. They were healing, love, and loyalty, woven together into something stronger than he'd ever known. As they sat together, bathed in the gentle quiet of their home, Clark felt an overwhelming gratitude. They were a family, not perfect, not without scars, but bound by a love that had weathered storms, mended brokenness, and built something whole. And for Clark, there was nothing in the world more hopeful than that. Wow, what an intense night, right? Mick's loyalty, his unbreakable bond with the family, and the mystery surrounding that old sedan. It's the kind of story that reminds us of how deep the connection between people and animals can be. It's not just loyalty. It's a love that truly goes beyond words. If you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves animals as much as you do, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would you trust a dog like Mick to protect your family? Also, if you're into more stories that tug at your heartstrings, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the quietest guardian is the one who loves us most. Until next time, take care and stay safe.